Hello, readers by eyes and by ears. This is Mighty Chan, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today we are continuing with the reading of Stars of Chaos, Volume 4, also known as Sha Po Lang, and we are finishing out Arc 13 with chapters 103 through 105. So I hope you all enjoy. Chapter 103, Encounter. As the revelries at the palace were reaching their peak, Chang Geng was in Miss Chan's temporary residence in the capital, helping her pick herbs. His cold had come quickly and gone just as fast. After a couple doses of medicine, he was well on his way to a full recovery. Even so, Guyun had advised him to avoid the banquet. First, on the account of the sensitive matter of his parentage, and second, because of Chen Qingshu's new lead on the Wu Ge. Thus, he had begged off sick to meet the doctor instead. You mean to say the Wu Ge flows within my blood? Chen Qingshu's hands were occupied flipping through a whole spread of yellowing books, pausing here and there to snatch the fragile pages that fluttered loose before they fell. Her hands were a flurry of movement, but her words were as measured as ever. Wu Ge acts on the mind, so I always thought this poison would be rooted in the brain. If not for the Marquis's remark, I would never have considered this angle. See here, the earliest record the barbarians have of the wicked god Wu Ge say this: treacherous at birth, he consumed the flesh and blood of his brother to fuel his own growth. He had 4 legs, 4 arms, 2 heads, and 2 hearts. Oceans of blood flowed within his chest, and he was brutal to the extreme. I'd always thought ocean of blood was only a metaphor, but it's actually a clue to the mechanism behind Wu Ge attacks. Only when Chen Qingshu spoke on this kind of topic could she spill so many words in one go. Flesh and blood. Chang Geng fell silent a moment, then shook his head with a wry laugh. Miss Chen means to say my entire body is suffused with poison, and the only recourse is to scrape my flesh clean from my bones like the heroes of legend? The prospect somehow seemed even worse than having something wrong with his head. Chang Geng sorted the herbs into their different types and placed them into containers one by one. The medicine rack's gears clicked against each other as the filled compartments slowly ascended, revealing new empty compartments underneath. This was precision work that took a patient and steady hand. Chen Qingshu looked at him with no small admiration. In recorded history, no one afflicted with Wu Ge had made it to adulthood with a clear mind, much less maintained such a tranquil temperament. Was it because he was naturally strong-willed, or because he had Guyun while others did not? I won't lie to you, Chang Geng said. I've been feeling unwell lately. The Wu Ge has been acting up more and more frequently. The Marquis told me, Chen Qingshu said without thinking. Chang Geng blinked in surprise. Guyun had always treated the Wu Ge as merely a strange barbarian poison and never seemed to take Chang Geng's little problem seriously. He rarely spoke of it and never showed any concern in front of Chang Geng. So he was actually worrying about it all this time? Chen Qingshu paused, realizing she had said too much. She tried a casual change of topic. Your Highness, if you have no other instructions, I plan to make a trip back to the Chen family residence in Shanxi soon. Treatment will be much easier now that we've discovered the root cause. We're sure to find a solution. Chang Geng hummed in acknowledgement and cupped his hands in a bow. Thank you for your trouble. But about the cure for Zixi. Before he could finish, they were interrupted by a messenger from the palace. A young medical apprentice led in the palace attendant, who made a polite bow to Chang Geng. Your Highness, His Majesty heard you were ill and ordered the servant to pay you a visit. He also sent an imperial physician, but the imperial physician felt it improper to set foot inside Miracle Dr. Chan's courtyard. He is waiting outside. Chang Geng frowned. My thanks to my brother for his attentions, but it was a cold, not any major ailment. Yes, this servant can see your Highness is in fine spirits, the attendant said with a smile. He hesitated for a moment before continuing. Your Highness, a banquet is being held in the palace this evening to welcome the barbarian third prince to the diplomatic delegation. The special envoy from the 18 tribes specifically mentioned your Highness to His Majesty, and His Majesty ordered this servant to convey a verbal decree. If you are feeling unwell, you needn't put yourself to any trouble, but if you are able, come out for some fresh air. Startled, Chen Qingshu shot Chang Geng a glance. It would have been one thing if no one commented on his absence, but given that the barbarian envoy had mentioned him by name, it wouldn't do for Chang Geng to refuse him outright. There was a layer of awkwardness here. The northern barbarians were Great Liang's enemy, but they were also His Highness Prince Yan's maternal family. He obviously shouldn't associate with them too willingly, yet it was also improper for him to intentionally avoid them. It was a delicate balance. The envoy had asked after him, but the key factor in Chang Geng's decision would be Li Feng's attitude. If there was one thing he could use as an excuse to keep to the shadows, it was this. Chang Geng good-naturedly produced a pouch from his lapels and handed it to the attendant. "If it isn't too much trouble, what did my brother say?" The attendant hefted the weight of Prince Yan's gratitude in his hand and smiled until his round face went completely red. He sputtered out a string of courtesies. "Oh, I could never, Your Highness, you overwhelmed this servant with your generosity. It's more than I deserve." Whether he deserved it or not, he happily tucked the cash away and finally got to the point. "Your Highness is a man of considerable status. You needn't show those bloodthirsty barbarians any particular respect. His Majesty said if your Highness is willing to make a social call, you should visit the palace to make your New Year's greetings. You oughtn't stay cooped up in your home. You can leave after sitting down a few minutes. No need to dance attendance on those insignificant others. His Majesty would be gratified to see you, especially as it's so close to the end of the year." Chang Geng understood. "Allow me to freshen up and change. I'll come to the palace at once." "In that case, this servant will go and prepare your carriage." The attendant cheerfully agreed. A faint smile remained on Chang Geng's face as he watched him leave, but his expression cooled as soon as he turned back into Miss Chun's workroom. Chen Qingxu followed him inside. "Can I help?" Chang Geng shook his head. "Security's tight at the palace banquet this year, and Zuxi is there too. Everyone who enters or exits has to pass several rounds of inspections. Aside from the third prince and the special envoy, all the rest of the barbarian entourage has been detained at the relay station. Even if that barbarian third prince is packed full with violet gold beneath his skin, he can't make much of an explosion. I only need you to lend me a room to freshen up." Chen Qingxu didn't make a habit of meddling in politics, so she didn't insert herself further. She instructed the apprentice to lead Chang Geng to a spare room. He walked to the doorway, his hands tucked behind his back, before suddenly pausing and turning around. "Miss Chen, would you happen to have a silver knife?" Wang Guo sat among the civil officials, listening to a group of Great Liang's silver-tongued civil servants vent their national enmity and personal grudges upon the barbarian envoy in the litany of criticism. The envoy's tongue wasn't quite so silver, but he managed to keep up with the flow. Whenever the conversation got a bit too heated and he was unable to respond, he would simply smile. It rather sold the story that he was indeed here to endure humiliation in order to ensure the success of their suit for peace. Imperial Uncle Wang's gaze lingered on the third prince, who was still silent, his head bowed. But his attention was quickly diverted. He had no interest in that idiot. He had planned a much better show. Wang Guo wasn't like Fang Qin and his influential allies who always kept their livelihood of the nation and its people hanging on their lips. He was well aware of his state of disgrace. He knew everyone looked down on him. Even Minister Fang and his people only addressed him with respect when they needed him. Behind his back, they called him the eunuch imperial uncle, just like the rest. They all whispered that he was so devoted to his responsibilities as imperial uncle that he'd even taken over the job of head eunuch managing general palace affairs. Wang Guo had used to be a minor figure who ran errands for the late emperor. He was destined to be an obsequious subject, a scapegoat for the throne. Since the situation between the late emperor and the barbarian consort erupted, he had lived every day in terror. It wasn't that he had anything against Gu Yun or the Gu family. There were no benefits to be gained for him there, as Great Liang's civil and military officials had few dealings. As long as neither side's ambitions exploded to the point of wanting to take full control of the court, they would never compete over shares of the same pot, no matter how they strove for power. Not to mention, if one were to compare Wang Guo and Gu Yun's families, the Gu family was the true noble clan. It was only that they were not blessed with many children and happened to be in a rather unique spot in terms of marriage alliances. Wang Guo had even fewer disputes with Gu Yun when it came to personal opinion. He had few thoughts on consequential matters of state, and his only insights were on how to make the emperor happy. The court was full of accomplished civil and military bigwigs with their own ideas and agendas. There had to be a few people with whom the emperor could relax after the time he spent testing his intellect and courage in the political arena, hadn't there? If possible, he'd have never raised a hand against the Gu family, even if he was out of his mind with boredom. But fate was impossible to scry, and an ordained ruler's order impossible to disobey. The old emperor was dead and gone, out like a candle's flame. Yet he had clung to the very end to his misguided beliefs that if a ruler ordered his subject's death, the subject would bare his neck for the blade. Wang Guo was left behind as the scapegoat and target of everyone's disdain. Right now, the long-gone emperor was still willing to protect this useless trash heap of an uncle out of nostalgia. He would allow Wang Guo to struggle forward on his last legs and beg a mouthful of sustenance to fill his meager bowl. But what of the future? Wang Guo had nothing to fear from any farm tax or civilian commerce decree Prince Yan proposed. What he feared was what Prince Yan would do to him if he took the throne. Prince Yan had been close to Gu Yuan since youth, but he was also the son of the late emperor and the barbarian consort. A child couldn't prosecute their parents' crimes, but when the time came, the first move Prince Yan would undoubtedly make to curry Gu Yuan's favor and gain the military's support would be to sacrifice the unfortunate Wang Guo to the Gu family's ancestors. Minister Fang and his ilk worried about Prince Yan's shuffling the cards of the court, but what did that amount to? They risked only their salary, status, good name, and the prospects of their family. Imperial Wang Guo's very life hung in the balance. He worried constantly about the head sitting atop his neck. High status and a generous salary were no good to him if he were dead. The barbarians had been on their best behavior since their arrival in the capital. They hadn't naively attempted to toss bribes around. Besides, the capital was filled with princes, dukes, and nobles. No one was poor and short-sighted enough to risk committing treason for such a measly profit. The special envoy from the 18 tribes sent out only one tentative feeler once the palace banquet was almost upon them, and the one he contacted was precisely Imperial Uncle Wang, this man who seemed nothing more than an insignificant sycophant. The special envoy swore upon the eternal sky and made two promises to Wang Guo. One, that Prince Yan would never again be the sword hanging over his head, and two, that whether their efforts succeeded or failed, they would never reveal Wang Guo's part in the plot. If, in the future, Wang Guo should ever find himself in mortal danger, the 18 tribes were willing to save his life. The unruly mob that was the 18 tribes was uncivilized, cruel, bloodthirsty, and far too fond of playing with poisons. But there was one good thing about them. They took their oaths seriously. And what they asked of Wang Guo was as easy as a lift of the hand. Prince Yan was likely to keep clear of the banquet to evade suspicion. Imperial Uncle Wang was to ensure he would make his appearance. The barbarians hadn't explained what they planned to do. Wang Guo intended to quietly watch events unfold, but in case they failed, he had a backup plan prepared. He had to hand it to Minister Fang for making it all possible. In order to unseat Prince Yan, Fang Qin had been secretly sheltering a certain man in the courtyard belonging to the Fang family. Years ago, when the barbarian consort fled the capital, a large group of palace servants, guards, and imperial physicians had been implicated in the case. Many of them were wrongfully put to death, while the true culprits had planned their escape routes ahead of time. The old imperial physician in the Fang family's courtyard was one such person. He had fled in guilt. Years later, however, his son had accidentally killed a man. To pay the blood debts of the younger generation, he was forced to sell a secret. Back when the barbarian consort had fled carrying her unborn child, Commandery Princess Xu, who had fled along with her, had also been pregnant out of wedlock. Xiu Niang, also known as Huga'ar, had colluded with the barbarians in their invasion in Yanhui town. She hated Great Liang to the bone. Had she really been content to raise the son of her enemy? Was the boy Gu Yuan brought back from Yanhui town really the late emperor's son? Or was he Huga'ar's bastard by an unknown father? Fang Qin had taken the imperial physician in, but done nothing rash. He had learned his lesson from the last time he failed to defeat Prince Yan. This time, he planned to strike true on the first attack. He was slowly brewing a plan in the shadows, but Wang Guo had no intention to wait for him any longer. Lords and ministers had their ways, but petty villains had their own paths to walk. He didn't need to take the high ground, and didn't matter how low he struck as long as it drew blood. When the envoy asked to meet Prince Yan, Li Feng hadn't replied right away. Upon finding that Prince Yan was ill, he ordered an attendant to run an errand and check on him in his stead. Li Feng's exact words were, "Bring an imperial physician to check on Amin and tell him to get some rest. If he's feeling better in a few days, he oughtn't stay cooped up in his home. He can visit the palace to pay us New Year's greetings. No need to dance attendance on insignificant others." With that, the long-gone emperor had fulfilled his obligation to appear at the palace banquet and took his leave. But Imperial Uncle Wang wasn't the eunuch imperial uncle for nothing. He had bribed a whole crew of seemingly unimportant errand runners. As long as the messenger skillfully distorted Li Feng's words just a touch, Prince Yan would come without a doubt. And when he did, there would be Prince Yan, running to the palace immediately after the emperor had left the scene to greet the barbarian delegation despite his illness. How would he turn the tide after his muddy origins and attempts to soil the imperial bloodline were exposed before the eyes of all? Li Feng's departure marked the peaceful passing of the majority of the palace banquet. Seeing the end in sight, Guyuan let out a breath of relief and picked up his cup of wine to moisten his lips. But he had hardly registered the taste of the alcohol when a palace attendant entered to report Prince Yan's arrival. Guyuan's heart thudded in his chest as he reeled at this sudden twist. Fang Qin looked mildly surprised. Wang Guo lowered his head. The envoy turned toward the door to the hall with a faint smile on his face. But the barbarian third prince, who had been quietly tucking into his meal in the corner, suddenly froze where he sat. Chang Geng noticed the throne was empty the moment he stepped into the grand hall. He knew at once that he had walked into a trap, but it was too late to turn back now. Chang Geng's gait didn't stall, and his face remained serene despite its mild pallor. His usual gentle and elegant smile played on his lips as he strolled inside, removing his cloak as he went. Using the movement of turning to hand it to a servant, he swept his gaze around the room. The attendant who had lured him here had already disappeared. A noble sitting nearby, though uncertain why Prince Yan had appeared, seized the opportunity to cast the first stone. "Your Highness, Prince Yan, didn't you excuse yourself from today's palace banquet?" he asked with an unkind chuckle. "It seems the words of our guests from the 18 tribes are weighty indeed. They've summoned Prince Yan from his sickbed with a single word." Another picked up where he left off. "You ought to penalize yourself with a drink for that. Perhaps you could find fault were it anyone else. But we're graced with no ordinary guests today. The 18 tribes are His Highness's maternal family. Of course they ought to receive special treatment." The sleeves of his wide court robes trailing nearly to the ground, Chang Geng calmly parried. "His Majesty went to the effort of sending someone to ask for me, so I've come to the palace specifically to give His Majesty my New Year's greetings. But it seems I've come at a bad time. Has His Majesty already left?" "His Highness Prince Yan has come at a bad time, but he came at just the right one. It is our fortune of 3 lifetimes to be able to meet the twin jades of Great Liang's court today. Our prince would like to offer His Highness a toast." The envoy from the 18 tribes stood, dragging the third prince up by the arm. Guyuan shot Shen Yi a look. Several guards hidden within the shadowed corners of the great hall suddenly revealed their killing intent, locking onto the envoy and the third prince. The third prince stepped out from amid the banquet seats. He seemed extremely nervous, his hand trembling so much around its wine cup that he spilled half the contents before he got anywhere close to Chang Geng. As the youth approached, a wave of restless heat rose in Chang Geng's body. The fever that had broken last night came back with a raging fury, and his ears roared, all the blood in his body roiling like burning violet gold. Every hair stood on end. All the countless pairs of eyes in the hall, alight with schemes and malicious glee, presented less pressure than a look from this slight young man. Chang Geng exhausted nearly all his strength to suppress his extreme discomfort and maintain the dignified bearing befitting a prince of the first rank as he forced his lips to smile. "Does the princes of your tribe always present toasts without saying a word?" The northern barbarian envoy began to chuckle. He retreated a slow step behind the third prince. All of a sudden, a calm came over the trembling young man. His pallid hands, frozen in midair, seemed to give off a corpse-like glow. He lifted his chin and met Chang Geng's gaze. Bloodshot eyes bore into Chang Geng like a stake of ice, revealing a pair of glacial twinned pupils. The young man was a Wuar Ge. No one knew what would happen when two such wicked gods faced off. There was no record of such an event. How lunatic a thing was the Wuar Ge? How vast a hatred, how great a convergence of fortune was required to create even one such creature? How turbulent did an age have to be to allow two Waragas to come face to face? The two seemed to share some indescribable connection. In a split second, the vastness of the great hall scattered like ash before Chang Geng's eyes, and pain erupted in his chest, as if in the next moment he would combust. Delusion and reality swirled into a mess before him, and the terrible poison he had kept suppressed within his blood and bones for years exploded outward like hot oil tossed over a raging blaze. All the irreconcilable hatred and fury in Chang Geng welled up in his heart. Every nightmare squirming in the depths of the abyss poured from its lair, gaping maws open wide to swallow him whole. Chapter 104. Inciting War. The barbarian envoy's smile contorted in Chang Geng's eyes, mysterious and sinister as the expression Huga'ar wore as she filled his ears with her malevolent curse on the brink of death. It was the poisonous resentment of the 18 tribes, built up like silt over thousands of years, striving against heaven and earth, striving against fellow humans in a desperate fight for survival. Chang Geng's field of view narrowed in on the silver cup in the third prince's hands. He felt as if he had been locked in a set of manacles weighing 1,000 kilograms. Yet to the eyes of a casual observer, he seemed merely to pause a moment before he spoke. Chang Geng lifted one hand under the crowd's watchful gaze. Although his lips were nearly devoid of color, he was elegant and composed as ever as he accepted a cup of wine from a nearby palace attendant. Anyone with eyes could see that Prince Yan had just recovered from illness. His hand was as pale and bloodless as his cheeks, and his fingers shook around the cup. He dropped his gaze and lightly tapped his cup against the one the third prince held. "Your Highness, please do as you will. I've been taking medicine and cannot tolerate wine, so I'm afraid I can't drink this toast," he said coolly. "We can have a proper drink together when the 18 tribes delivers this year's tribute." The third prince stared at Chang Geng through those twinned pupils. Chang Geng touched the wine cup to his lips, then tossed the silver cup aside and strode past the barbarian envoy without a sideways glance. To everyone else, it appeared His Highness Prince Yan was simply taking a cold attitude with an enemy diplomat, but Gu Yuan could see the aggressive discomfort he was repressing from the ghostly pallor on his face. There was indeed something amiss with that third prince. Gu Yuan's heart sank, and he shot Shen Yi a look. Understanding the unspoken command, Shen Yi slipped quietly from the great hall. Gu Yuan pushed aside everyone in his way and walked toward Chang Geng. "Your Highness, please come inside to rest," he called out. He was still a few steps away when his sensitive nose caught the faint scent of blood. Remembering Miss Chun's vague remark about tea and blood, he was immediately unsettled. At the same time, the barbarian envoy was stepping forward. As if he had entirely failed to read the atmosphere, he said, "Thinking back to how the goddess of our tribe perished in a foreign land, I never imagined I would meet the heir to her bloodline one day. Surely this is a blessing imparted to us by the endless sky." "Prince Yan is a rightful member of our Great Liang's imperial house," Xu Ling coolly retorted. "Envoy, your remark is inappropriate." The barbarian envoy stared into Chang Geng's eyes as if searching for something in their depths. The longer he looked, the more shocked he grew. A Wu'er Ge was difficult to refine for several reasons. Not only must its maker have the resolve to resort to such cruel extremes, it also required exactly the right combination of time, place, and person. The host must possess a tenacious temperament in order to give the bloodline of the wicked god sufficient time to ripen. If they lost control too early, their mind would remain immature, their cognitive development never progressing beyond that of an idiot child. The third prince was an example of such a failure. This innocent child had been born with a twin brother, the lives of both boys forfeited to the father's hatred. The child's mind had failed to withstand his first Wu'er Ge attack, and he was already ruined. His only remaining use was as a sacrifice to another wicked god. By comparison, this Prince Yan standing before them was a specimen of the highest quality. He had maintained clarity of mind this whole time and upheld his veneer of calm even when face to face with the sacrifice. How indomitable was his will to accomplish this! The wicked god Wuarga was born through an act of devouring. When one Wuarga approached another weaker, incomplete specimen, the stronger's base instincts would be triggered. They would lose their senses. This was why the failed Wuarga was called a sacrifice. If a person with the right knowledge was there to provide ample guidance and take control of the stronger's mind when they lost themselves, with the aid of some medicine, the puppet master would compel the wicked god to obey their every command until the Wuarga broke down entirely. Xiunyang herself probably never imagined the wicked god she gave up on halfway through would be this strong. Unfortunately, this creature had been whisked away by the unknowing Central Plains people. Not only had it failed to reach its true potential, it had become a keen blade turned back on the 18 tribes themselves. My king once met your highness in the little town of Yanhui. Back then, he still thought you were Hugar's child, born of her violation. He was extremely rude to your highness then. He ordered the subject to deliver his apologies in the course of these peace talks. The corner of the barbarian's envoy's lips curled up as he seamlessly wove the words that would trigger the Wuarga into his speech. Your highness, has Hugar ever said anything to you about the 18 tribes? The words Hugar said surfaced from the nonsense small talk, whipping up a tempest within Chang Geng's mind, with no one the wiser. The image of this sturdy barbarian envoy overlapped with the mysterious and beautiful Hugar, and the curse that woman wailed with her last breath erupted like a peal of thunder in his ears. An unidentifiable scent emanated from the third prince's body and poured into his lungs, slightly metallic and slightly bitter. It yanked on Chang Geng's nerves with its full might to summon the bloodthirsty urges within him. The door flew open on memories he had sealed away, drowning him in a crashing torrent of fragmented recollections. Hugar's nightmarishly beautiful face, the corpses strewn around the bandit's mountain, the great fire that formed his first memory, the inescapable stench of blood, endless curses and beatings. Every old scar beneath his beautiful court robes came alive with a vengeance, diving into his flesh like blood-sucking leeches, as if his mortal frame was unable to bear the vast power of the wicked god. Chang Geng's chest, limbs, and every bone felt lacerated by blades. It was the pain that signified an oncoming Wu-Arge attack. Even worse, these words from the barbarian envoy, which had such a monstrous effect, were perfectly calculated to make their victim appear to be overreacting to a perfectly innocuous remark. Wang Guo immediately joined the pile on. Envoy, is it entirely appropriate to bring up Princess Xu, Hugar, on this august occasion? While Princess Xu did a meritorious deed in raising His Highness Prince Yan, she was also guilty of exacerbating the hostilities between our nations to the point of nearly inciting a war 9 years ago. Not to mention, I've heard that Princess Xu was quite the troublemaker. She plotted against the Black Iron Battalion, then convinced the noble consort to flee with her when her plans failed. From what I heard, she even got herself mixed up with some unknown man. Did you never hear the rumor that came out from the Imperial Academy of Medicine? They say Princess Xu was pregnant out of wedlock. A woman like this does not deserve the title of commandery princess of our court, nor the goddess of your tribe. Even the densest listener could discern the veiled meaning within these words. At the sight of Wang Guo so boldly brandishing his hidden blades against Prince Yan himself, all those who had been chiming in with their agreements turned mute, waiting for the next development in bewilderment. When they turned back to Prince Yan, they saw that, whether out of discomfort from his illness or something else, beads of sweat were rolling down his forehead. He seemed to be struggling to stand. Fang Qin's brow creased in a frown. He saw the bigger problem at once. Wang Guo and the barbarians had allied at some point without his noticing. He could spare no time delighting in Prince Yan's plight. He was on the verge of a breakdown. Internal strife was one thing. It was expected that people would jockey for position within the court. Whether any winner emerged to ink their name in the history books, or whether it was not but an endless struggle with no victors, it was all domestic affairs. But what was Wang Guo thinking, bringing these foreign tribes into it while their borders were yet unrecovered? And a great swath of the country still lay in enemy hands. If he were to be exposed, no, he didn't even need to be exposed. If Wang Guo managed to successfully insinuate that Prince Yan had muddied the imperial bloodline, what would the rest think once they recovered from their shock? No one would believe the Fang family innocent. Fang Qing's faction was publicly aligned with Wang Guo, and the guilty old imperial physician who had spilled the secret was even now living in the Fang family's courtyard. He would never wash his hands of this. Fang Qing was drenched in cold sweat. Wang Guo had not only used him, at this rate, he was going to have him strung up as a traitor to the nation. Minister Fang didn't think he lagged behind anyone in talent or cunning. But just look at Prince Yan. The young man had a right hand in Jiang Chong, an ally righteous in speech and action in Xu Ling, over half the Lingshu Institute in his pocket, and commanded the loyalty of the northern camp, with whom he had once fought shoulder to shoulder. He even had close ties to the Marquis of Order, the commander-in-chief of the Southwest Army, and other military top brass. In Fangqing, he was surrounded by the Liu faction, Wang Guo and their ilk, venomous serpents and petty miscreants, people whose failures well outnumbered their accomplishments. For a moment, an ice-cold fatigue flooded Fangqing's heart. He experienced the full weight of that thing called fate, unerring as the tide. Was it truly impossible to resist by human will alone? Listening to Wang Guo's attempts to stir the pot, the barbarian envoy sneered disdainfully. He watched as Prince Yan's pupil dilated. It wouldn't be long before they split entirely, and Prince Yan sank into hallucinations. At that point, he would become deaf to the outside world save for certain key words and spells. He would transform from a man of mortal flesh and blood into a true wicked god. The barbarian envoy reached out as if to offer Chang Geng a supporting hand. "Your Highness, are you not feeling?" Before he could say well, a voice exploded furiously from nearby. "Insolence!" The envoy's pupils contracted. A stiff breeze whistled past his ear, its cold, deadly aura seeping into his pores. Every hair on his body stood on end, and before he could react, he felt a chill at his neck and found a steel blade pressed against it. Before the astonished eyes of the court, Guyuan held a sword he had drawn from the guard's waist in one hand and pulled Prince Yan into his embrace with the other. Chang Geng leaned into him with a muttered groan as if he had lost the strength to stand. Yet the twin pupils the barbarian envoy watched for did not appear. Chang Geng was clearly still lucid. He followed Guyuan's lead and struck back at the envoy in a wisp of a voice. "The barbarians. Shamanic poisons." Xu Ling cried out in alarm. "Your Highness, what have they done to you?" Blood dripped down the sleeve of Chang Geng's court robes. The cloth was swiftly soaked with red. Every guard in the hall drew their weapons. Wang Guo was unprepared for this development. But after a moment of shock, he pressed on, refusing to let his efforts go to waste. "Marshal, if you have something to say, speak civilly. There's no need for violence. What has happened to His Highness? Summon the imperial physicians. Where are the imperial physicians?" Guyuan's head whipped around. He said not a word, but a killing intent as keen as a black iron wind slasher fixed on Imperial Uncle Wang. Wang Guo's legs immediately went soft, and he collapsed onto his rear with a cry of shock. As soon as Wang Guo uttered the words "imperial physician," the corner of Fang Qing's eye twitched violently. He couldn't sit by any longer. If he was to draw a line between himself and Wang Guo, it was now or never. He had to find a way to push the blame onto that sniveling rat bastard. Otherwise, he would resign himself to infamy for the rest of history. Fang Qing whispered furious orders to his attendant, instructing him to silence that guilty old imperial physician as soon as humanly possible. Then he calmly stepped forward. "How audacious these barbarians are, to act so brazenly in full view of the imperial court. They clearly mean us ill. Detain them!" Unfortunately, aside from a few palace guards, the soldiers on duty were all members of the Imperial Guard or the Northern Camp. These men would never defer to a civil official like him. They stood still as stone, waiting for Gu Yuan's order. Fang Qin choked, but now wasn't the time to be scrambling after his own dignity. He gathered himself and turned his flattery on, full bore. Marshal Gu, there's something very queer about all this. The palace attendants ought to have known His Majesty left the banquet. Why would they ask Prince Yan to come to the palace tonight? And if they did, they ought to have brought His Highness to see His Majesty directly, not to the banquet. I propose we detain these criminals for interrogation, then report to His Majesty. We must carefully investigate the exact course of events this evening. Perhaps barbarian spies are involved. Why don't you first take Prince Yan to rest and summon the imperial physicians? Gu Yuan coldly interrupted his guilty rambling. Please don't put yourself to the trouble. Never had Fang Qin encountered such a stubborn mule since the day he'd left his mother's womb. He forgot his lines. A guard in the uniform of the northern camp ran inside. Sir, we've surrounded the relay station and detained all members of the barbarian diplomatic delegation. Fang Qin stared in shock. Did Gu Yuan intend to start a war? Report this incident to His Majesty at once. Gu Yuan gave his orders with swift efficiency. The imperial physicians have no understanding of these dirty barbarians' tricks. Summon Miracle Dr. Chun to the palace. Now that Gu Yuan had taken charge, the situation would be handled in a brisk and orderly fashion, even if the sky fell on their heads. Both Chen Qingxu and the Longgan Emperor were notified of the incident straight away and hurried to the scene. Li Fang hastened over to examine Chang Geng as Fang Qin stepped forward without any prompting from Gu Yuan to relate the night's events and his own suspicions. The Longgan Emperor was furious. He commanded every single servant and palace attendant to be detained. Chen Qingxu he allowed inside to attend to Prince Yan, while her apprentice stayed behind to help identify the suspect. The servants faced interrogation outside, but Gu Yuan, disinclined to watch them lash out at each other, remained by Chang Geng's side. His hand was slick with blood. Even the wooden beads the late emperor had given him were dyed scarlet. His complexion looked terrible, even worse than the injured party. It's all right. The wound is self-inflicted. Chang Geng looked at him and said, I had it well in hand. Like hell you did, Gu Yuan bit out. You really had to come here and see what the barbarian looked like for yourself? I seriously... Chen Qingxu spoke quietly as she prepared salt water for Chang Geng. Marshal Gu, please calm yourself. The body of a Wu'er Ge is unlike ordinary people. A minor injury won't do him much harm. Your Highness, what did you encounter that forced you to bleed yourself? Chang Geng let his lashes flutter closed. When he opened them again, his eyes were even clearer than usual. If not for the fact that Gu Yuan had yet to wash this man's blood from his hands, he would have suspected Chang Geng faked everything. Wary of listeners, Chang Geng answered in sign language. They tricked me into the palace. I had thought, even if the 18 tribes came with hostile intent, it would be foolish of them to play any tricks. Regardless of whether they're sincere about negotiating peace or simply stalling for time, our entire army is on high alert. I never expected the barbarian envoy to be so bold as to act against me in the open. Not to mention, even Fang Qin's cautious nature. I reasoned he probably wouldn't risk anything truly treasonous. Probably? Gu Yuan snapped. Eager to deflect Gu Yuan's rage, Chen Qingxu pressed Chang Geng. Your Highness, could you explain in more detail? Chang Geng cast Gu Yuan a cautious glance, then briefly described the third prince's abnormalities and the strange scent he remembered. Chen Qingxu managed to staunch the bleeding while still sparing an eye to follow his hands. Slowly, a frown creased her brow. It wasn't necessarily Fang Qin who lured me here. Chang Geng offered his analysis of the situation. He's not stupid enough to let the barbarians use him, and his eagerness to jump in may have been an attempt to clear himself of suspicion. But on reflection, the envoy from the 18 tribes merits further investigation. Just looking at Chang Geng upset Gu Yuan right away. He turned to face the window instead, putting him out of sight. One of his hands unwittingly hovered at the hilt of the sword sheathed at his waist, and the vicious gloom lingering about him had yet to disperse. He had come to similar conclusions even before Chang Geng's explanation. The one who bribed the palace attendant was more likely than not Wang Guo, who had been so impatiently champing at the bit just now. Gu Yuan had always considered Wang Guo and his kind to be mangy dogs following shamelessly at the late emperor's heels. He had never felt the need to stoop to their level and confront them. But now, it seemed his restraint had given certain imperial uncles the false impression he had a good temper. Chang Geng squeezed the back of Gu Yuan's hand with an ice-cold paw, the picture of an aggrieved and pathetic patient. Zishi, I feel terrible. Look at me. Now it was Chen Qingxu pretending she could ignore the things happening right in front of her if she simply averted her eyes. Gu Yuan's heart hurt so much his chest was stuffy with it, but he had no outlet for this feeling. He wished for nothing more than to don his armor and leave the capital this very instant to pluck off Jiala Yinghuo's head. It was a long, silent moment before he suppressed his rage sufficiently to continue the conversation. Perhaps they wanted to assassinate His Majesty at first, but found the capital's defenses were tighter than they imagined and made you their target instead. Or else, they were here specifically for the Wu'erge. The barbarians must have a way of controlling the curse. During a Wu'erge attack, the host has immense strength, surpassing the limitations of the human body. The guards in the Great Hall would be afraid to hurt you. If the barbarians used you as a shield, the guards may not have been able to stop them. I can think of only one reason they would have gone to such trouble. This diplomatic delegation is here not to broker peace, but to incite war. If Jiala Yinghuo wants a war, he could mobilize his army. Why go to such convoluted lengths to start one? Chang Geng countered. But perhaps General Cai's intelligence isn't entirely without merit. There must be something going on within the 18 tribes. Forget the 18 tribes for now. Gu Yuan interrupted him. You heard what Wang Guo said in the Great Hall. He's getting desperate. We don't know what he'll try next. Why don't you focus on meeting his attacks first? Chapter 105. Casting Aside the Bow. Chang Geng was silent a while, eyes dim as he mindlessly rubbed at the prominent joints of Gu Yuan's fingers. Finally, he sighed. There's nothing I can do. No one can testify to the circumstances of his own birth. Besides, the truth was he had never fully accepted his own identity as royalty, even after he became Prince Yan and stood near the pinnacle of power. Chang Geng felt like he could hold up the skies, but he couldn't say for sure who his parents were. On top of that, he had Gu Yuan now. He wasn't particularly eager to chase after his exact origins. Unfortunately, his lack of interest didn't mean others felt the same. Chen Qingxu stopped the bleeding and bandaged Chang Geng's wound with great efficiency, then wrote him a prescription to pacify the spirit and calm the heart. She didn't insert herself into the conversation, nor let any emotion show on her face, but an unspeakable sorrow and fury welled up in her heart. Chen Qingxu had opposed giving the Lin Yuan tablet to Prince Yan because of the Wu'erge. Her single vote against him had no effect on the final outcome, so she could do nothing but watch over Chang Geng all this time, taking note of his every action to the extent of her abilities. Since they had begun rebuilding the battered capital, Prince Yan had reassembled the mangled court bit by bit. He had rushed all over the nation, infiltrated deep into a rebel faction, and nearly perished in the process, and questioned lines of profit no one else dared touch. His actions made him the target of open condemnation and whispered ire from every corner of the court. These unmatched accomplishments ought to have secured his place in history for 1,000 years. Could they really be erased by a few questions about his origins? If he really wasn't the late emperor's son, did the war beacon tickets, the Canal Commission, and even the 100,000 refugees happily settled and hard at work in Jiangbei count for nothing? Chen Qingxu had spent years braving the Jianghu. She was no naive. She understood all the logical reasons behind this mode of thought. But there were still moments here and there where she shivered at the coldness of this world and the beliefs of its people. Oh, right, Miss Chen. Chang Geng's voice drew her back from her thoughts. She blinked. What is it? If His Majesty asks, I'll be troubling you to help keep my secrets. Chen Qingxu quickly gathered herself and nodded. Gu Yuan stood up, pinching the bridge of his nose. Okay. You two can keep chatting. You've pissed me off to no end, but I really can't stay. I need to at least go back and check on the situation. With a hum of acknowledgement, Chang Geng reluctantly released his hand. He stared imploringly at Gu Yuan until he managed to catch his eye, then showed him a brilliant and ingratiating smile. Gu Yuan stood firm, face stoic as he returned Chang Geng's gaze. What are you smiling at? Chang Geng beamed back at him. If he had a tail, it would have been wagging so hard by now it was about to go bald. Finally, Gu Yuan couldn't resist any longer and helplessly patted his head with a small smile. You bastard. He turned and walked off, leaving a smug-looking Prince Yan and a faintly green Miss Chun. The northern camp, once summoned into the capital, rounded up the barbarians with the greatest of ease. The delegation was separated and imprisoned in the imperial dungeons to await interrogation. Meanwhile, the patrolling Imperial Guard captured a palace attendant attempting to sneak out amid the chaos. Tun Qingshu's apprentice recognized him on sight as the one who had falsified an imperial edict to trick Prince Yan into coming to the palace banquet. The servant was merely a lowly subordinate running what he'd thought was a small errand. The severity of the proceedings broke him before they'd even begun the interrogation proper. He started out hollering, Your Majesty, my lords, please, judge this situation with clear eyes. This servant did not falsify anything. This servant conveyed His Majesty's verbal edict word for word. It was His Highness Prince Yan who insisted on entering the palace to meet His Majesty. He was still defending himself when Jiang Chong waved for someone to summon Dr. Chan's assistant. The little medical apprentice, though young, already exemplified the admirable characteristics of the Chun family. Upon seeing so many powerful figures gathered in one room, the youth showed no sign of panic and displayed a perfect memory by repeating the attendant's conversation with Prince Yan word for word. How could this band of cunning politicians fail to understand the implications? Before Li Feng could lash out, Fang Qin launched the first volley in a towering fury. Who instructed you to say this? Struck by inspiration mid-crisis, the palace attendant immediately chose to save his own skin. It was Imperial Uncle Wang. Imperial Uncle Wang often instructs the servants on how to better serve our ruler, and he said, since His Majesty asked after His Highness at such a time, that meant he intended to summon him to the palace, and that I should take initiative and make sure he gets the message. Li Feng turned the ring on his thumb and sneered. Is that what we intended? Perhaps even we don't know anymore. Wang Guo crashed to his knees. He'd known from the moment his people failed to locate the old imperial physician that Fang Qin had abandoned him. Fang Qin was gracious on the surface, but vicious at heart. He cared not a whit for personal relationships or impersonal justice, and could turn on someone in the blink of an eye. Wang Guo should have known that Fang Bastard and the Liu faction had been so cozy they practically walked about in the same pair of pants. Yet didn't Fang Qin sell them out and betray them with a snap of his fingers all the same? The attendant screamed his innocence, but only managed a few more wailed pleas before he was gagged and dragged away. Fang Qin spoke next. Your Majesty, Imperial Uncle Wang is the beloved uncle of our nation. This subject refuses to believe him capable of committing treason and colluding with foreigners. Your Majesty, you must investigate carefully and prove his innocence. The defense ready behind Imperial Uncle Wang's lips was shoved back down his throat by Fang Qin's words. He had been prepared to decry this malignment, betting the emperor still had some goodwill for this uncle of his, or would at least hesitate to put an old subject to death. Perhaps he would find it in his heart to let him off. Wang Guo had at worst committed the serious crime of falsifying an imperial edict and deceiving his liege. But if the long-gone emperor himself was unwilling to pursue the case, he could plausibly give out that Imperial Uncle Wang was getting on in years, and that, in his muddled old age, he had misheard an imperial edict. Perhaps he had rambled to his servants, as he was prone to do, and merely caused a misunderstanding. But Fang Qin was entirely too ruthless. Now that he had spoken, it would be impossible for Li Feng to protect Wang Guo even if he wanted to. To do so would be tantamount to admitting the imperial uncle's guilt. If Wang Guo was truly innocent, he would welcome a thorough investigation. The problem was that he was not at all innocent. Would the barbarians protect him? Would the gift he hadn't managed to get his hands on in time protect him? Would those traitorous palace eunuchs protect him? Wang Guo steeled himself. The only option left was to try muddying the waters even further. This old subject deserves 1,000 deaths, Wang Guo said, loud and clear. It's true that I was impatient to see Prince Yan and distorted His Majesty's intent. Li Feng narrowed his eyes. We never realized Prince Yan had become such a precious sight. He is a constant presence in the court, and we have never seen Uncle particularly friendly with him. Pray tell, why was Uncle overcome with the need to see him after just a few days of leave? Courage bolstered by malicious conviction, Wang Guo kowtowed with his forehead to the ground, face tense with resolve. Your Majesty, This is a long story known to very few. Several days ago, while visiting Minister Fang's residence, the subject became drunk and lost his way. Wandering the residence, I accidentally encountered a man I found somewhat familiar. Only later in the course of our conversation did I realize I had seen this man many years ago. Your Majesty, you were still young at the time. He was the most renowned imperial physician of the Imperial Academy of Medicine and very close to the barbarian noble consort. In fact, he was implicated when she disappeared, and he fled in guilt. Internally, Fang Qin scoffed, but he affected an outward look of confusion. Imperial Uncle Wang, what do you mean by this? Are you claiming I harbored a fugitive of the imperial court in my home? Your Majesty, this is absurd. Li Fang leveled them with a cool look. Wang Guo acted as though he hadn't heard a thing. At the time, this subject was terribly shocked. After speaking a few words with the man, I learned that this old imperial physician had ended up at Minister Fang's door when his son ran into some trouble. Absolute nonsense! I would never violate the law for personal gain, Fang Qin cried. Wang Guo sneered. Of course, Minister Fang was unmoved at first, but in exchange for Minister Fang's protection, the old imperial physician offered up a fascinating secret. The barbarian Princess Xu was in fact with child when she left the palace. What Minister Fang made of this? Who can say? Minister Fang is so cunning. Perhaps he already silenced that old imperial physician and his entire family. And dead men tell no tales. But, Your Majesty, we all know Princess Xu colluded with Jiala and Yinghuo to breach our borders in Yanhui town. Certain generals were personally on the scene. Although I have no evidence, those barbarians were certainly aware of this as well. You have only to interrogate them to prove the truth of my words. It was an outright declaration that Prince Yan's parentage was in doubt, made in front of the whole court. Li Fang slowly sucked in a breath. Has this old dog Wang Guo gone mad? Fang Qin thought. He'd sacrifice himself just to drag me into the muck? He called out, The barbarians are devious foes, eager to see our great Liang fall into internal turmoil. How could you suggest His Majesty trust their wicked words? Imperial uncle, it seems to me that the one who has conspired with barbarians in secret is you. Wang Guo threw everything he had into this gambit. He knocked his forehead against the ground again and again, accompanied by the firecrackers popping away in every street and alleyway. The sharp crack of his head against the floor was enough to scare the Nian beast away for good. This old subject will swear his loyalty on the heavens and earth. But the imperial bloodline cannot be muddied. Ever since I met that old physician, I held suspicions in my heart. After all this time, I found them unbearable. This is the only reason I chose the ill-advised course of inviting His Highness Prince Yan into the palace, all because you thought you could obtain evidence from those barbarians that His Highness Prince Yan is not a descendant of the late emperor? Fang Qin cut him off. Imperial Uncle Wang, how concerned you are for the stability of the nation. Your Majesty, let's imagine His Highness Prince Yan is indeed a spy sent into the palace by the barbarian to muddy the imperial bloodline. Does that mean the one the Marquis of Anding retrieved from Yanhui town on the late emperor's orders was a false prince? A fisheye passed off as a pearl? Why not summon Marshal Gu and General Shun here and get to the bottom of this? Let's discover exactly what these two famed generals of our nation intended. As if on cue, an attendant arrived to report the Marquis of Anding's arrival. Send him in, Li Fang ordered, face stormy. Gu Yuan had caught Fang Qin's words on his way in. He didn't bother with niceties, but knelt down and got straight to the point. Your Majesty, back then, the subject searched for the fourth prince on the late emperor's orders. We reported his physical characteristics, age, and the jade token he carried to the late emperor and returned him to the capital with His Majesty's express approval. The late emperor personally claimed him as his son. What's more, this subject recalls Your Majesty once mentioning that His Highness Prince Yan suffered considerably in his youth and was abused by his adoptive mother. That barbarian woman had no sincere feelings for him and must have reluctantly raised him solely because she was unwilling to part with her sister's only child. Though the tiger is vicious, it does not eat its own young. Had she really carried His Highness Prince Yan in her own womb, would she have treated him this way? What mother in the world could bear to do so? Gu Yuan could talk circles around anyone the instant he opened his mouth. Fang Qin's mouth twitched into a smile. After finishing his speech, Gu Yuan turned toward Wang Guo. This subject has another question for Imperial Uncle Wang. What advantage do I gain by muddying the imperial bloodline? Allow me to speak frankly. The Black Iron Battalion has been stationed in the Northwest for years. If I were plotting with the barbarians, the gates of our nation in the Northwest would have swung open 100,000 times by now. Imperial Uncle, you've spent so much time worrying over the affairs of others, but have you managed to clear your own name of suspicion for colluding with those barbarian women to slaughter loyal subjects 20 years ago? Wang Guo was genuinely afraid of Gu Yun, and his fright was mixed with guilt. He was cowardly by nature and had only made it as far as he had today through sheer desperation. Now that Gu Yun was here before him, he couldn't even speak properly, let alone manage another impassioned tirade. Cold sweat poured down his back. Lowering himself to speak these few words to Wang Guo seemed to have exhausted Gu Yun's sparse patience. He turned away and stepped forward to address the emperor directly. Your Majesty, the barbarians have gone too far. This subject has been in the capital over half a year, and my windslasher is covered with 2 fingers worth of rust. There is no need to hide our blades any longer. This subject requests deployment to the northern border. Gu Yun had considered this request over and over on the way here. The barbarian envoy's tricks, combined with the rumors relayed by General Cai's spies, suggested that Jiala Yinghuo was likely facing rebellion in his own backyard. Gu Yun needed to go to the northern border as soon as possible to verify this information. If the northern barbarians really were caught up in internal strife, this would be the ideal time to attack. Even if the northern lands had nothing else to their name, they were rich in one thing: violet gold mines. If Great Liang used this war to fuel the next, perhaps an engagement with the North wouldn't exhaust them but bolster their strength instead. Li Feng, however, frowned. In his opinion, Gu Yun's request was too abrupt. He was caught between a rock and a hard place. An attack on the capital and an invasion in Jiangnan both amounted to losing half their nation to the enemy. But to the princes, dukes, and nobles of the city, being forced to move the capital and beat a hasty retreat was vastly different from having foreigners squat on some faraway riverbank where the emperor's influence was weak. The latter seemed much less urgent a concern. After all, the skeletons scattered about a ghost village where the people's tears ran dry amidst the dust kicked up by foreign hooves weren't the ones beneath their silk and satin robes. Right now, real gold and silver were slowly filling the national treasury, and a great batch of refugees had recently been settled. The nation had enjoyed only a few peaceful days. With all this in mind, Li Feng wasn't particularly keen on restarting the war right now. On the other hand, although Li Feng's ambitions had been losing their edge, he still had his temper. If an investigation found that the barbarians had indeed come to slap him across the face, he couldn't bear the insult. These two conflicting interests fought to a stalemate in his head. He waved Gu Yun's request off for the time being. Imperial Uncle, please rise. Mobilizing the army is not a decision made in haste. We will discuss this again after the interrogation. Guards, strip Wang Guo of his official robes and detain him for questioning. The Imperial Court of Judicial Review will take charge. Detain that despicable servant too. Li Feng rose and, without giving Gu Yun another chance to speak, said, We will check on Amin. After watching Prince Yan deal so skillfully with Gu Yun, Chen Qingxu had figured the brute would pull through. She was preparing to leave when she ran into Li Feng on his way in and hastily dropped an unpracticed curtsy. Li Feng had met her when he broke his leg. We have troubled Miracle Dr. Chen, he said politely. How is Prince Yan? Chen Qingxu fabricated a likely tale on the spot. The barbarians used a rare poison that confuses the mind. Perhaps they wanted to kidnap His Highness and use him as a cover to escape. Fortunately, His Highness reacted swiftly and slashed himself to bleed out the poison. He's much better now. Li Feng didn't quite follow the rest of it, but frowned at a certain detail. He turned to Chang Geng and asked evenly, What did you use to cut your arm? You really were too vicious with yourself. On the surface, he appeared worried about Chang Geng's injury, but his real question was, why did Chang Geng come carrying a knife? Chang Geng, the very picture of a weak and sickly patient, slowly got down off the bed and knelt, using the headboard for support. When this subject received Brother's imperial edict, I was at Miss Chen's residence. I enjoy working with herbs and medicines in my free time, and I was helping her organize her medicinal ingredients. The palace servant was impatient, and in my haste, it seemed I took her silver knife with me. I merely used what I had on hand in the moment. So saying, he produced a knife shorter than the length of a finger from a nearby tray. It was a tiny thing, only useful for cutting medicinal herbs, and the blade wasn't even sharpened, duller than a cutlery knife. It wasn't any sort of weapon at all. The violence with which Prince Yan had used it on himself was evident as well. His strike had left the small blade bent out of shape. Chang Qingxu felt terribly conflicted. She could see the hidden needles within this conversation, as well as the seamlessness with which Chang Geng's plan fell into place. She bade them farewell, leaving Li Feng and Chang Geng alone in the room. Li Feng studied Chang Geng's face. He was very handsome, but his features weren't the perfectly proportioned lines of wealthy nobility. He had a pair of deep-set eyes, passionate and expressive, matched with heartless and fickle thin lips. He had just bled, and his cheeks retained an unhealthy pallor. Upon closer inspection, his brows and eyes bore a slight resemblance to the former barbarian consort, while the straight ridge of his nose resembled the late emperor. Yet, put together, he didn't look like anyone at all. The young man had the face of one born under an unlucky star, destined to walk alone, with neither friend nor family beside him. Li Feng quietly averted his gaze. There are some rumors going around. Don't take them to heart. Just focus on healing from your injuries. That old bastard Wang Guo has been coddled beyond all reason these last few years. I promise I'll see him give you what you're owed. Chang Geng knew Li Feng had indeed taken them to heart as soon as he had told him to do otherwise. Are you saying I'm not the child of the late emperor? He asked of his own volition. With a smile, Li Feng parroted Gu Yuan's argument. You're thinking too much. The late emperor personally acknowledged you as his son. Who would dare doubt his claim? No one can really be sure of things, Chang Geng said after a moment's consideration. If it's come to this, will you allow me to temporarily step down from my position as the head of the Grand Council to avoid suspicion? Li Feng narrowed his eyes and didn't respond right away. Chang Geng chuckled without much humor. The new reforms in governance have just been established. Even if I stay, I don't know what further contributions I can make. I'll only be attracting others' hatred. I hope Brother will sympathize with my situation. These words plucked right at Li Feng's heartstrings. An emperor's best weapon was balance. When the Liu Yang faction and the Imperial Guard rebelled, he had been forced to crack down on Great Liang's noble families of old. At the same time, the newly promoted officials had charged their way onto center stage with the support of the major merchants and were poised now to become even stronger. Li Feng could tolerate these young sprouts, and he was happy to see them push against those arrogant noble families. But he absolutely could not allow them to grow into towering trees that tore through the rafters of his home. This faction was growing far too quickly. Even the imperial uncle of the nation couldn't keep himself out of the fray. This time it was Wang Guo. Who next? Would the emperor be forced to cleanse every prince and duke in his court? What would the surname of the nation be then? If the government reforms sought to carve out a fresh and bloody path, some would inevitably be sacrificed to the new order. He looked at Chang Geng. All right. You have suffered much in recent days. It's only right for you to take time to convalesce. The skies changed overnight. An imperial uncle who had enjoyed the highest of favor throughout 2 reigns was consigned to the dungeons. Countless attendants in the palace shared connections with him. They were dragged out for interrogation, one by one. Fear reigned beyond the many-layered palace walls, and a whole pile of minor misdemeanors were ferreted out like mud brought up with a radish pulled from the ground. The old case of the attack on the Black Iron Battalion was unavoidably dug up once again, and like monkeys scattered from a fallen tree, the court scrambled to draw a line between themselves and the Wang family. Everyone was afraid the tiniest stain would drag them into collective punishment. The barbarian envoy who had instigated the scandal was secretly detained. The northern camp patrolled in shifts on high alert. But even Fang Qin couldn't have predicted the conclusion of this episode. Prince Yan, that constant thorn in his side, resigned from his official position, and the long-gone emperor allowed it. Despite his age, this was the first time in Fang Qing's life he had truly experienced the unpredictability of the world. Back when he brought every plot and scheme against Prince Yan, the man was perfectly untouched, while Fang Qing nearly sacrificed himself in the process. This time, he'd had no intention of getting involved. He was merely anxious to distance himself from Wang Guo and hadn't hesitated to stand on the same side as his political enemy to do it. Yet somehow, he'd gotten exactly what he wanted. No wonder the ancients said, even demons and deities cannot speak to an emperor's intent. A heavy fall of snow that night glazed the plum blossoms in the Marquis estate in a crystal clear layer of frost, suspending their color elegantly in ice. The passengers returning home instructed their carriage to stop at the entrance. Snow capped the tops of the gas lamps, dutifully casting their patches of light from where they hung over the twin gates. With a long sigh, the iron puppets guarding the door creaked around, and steam drifted into the air as the gates swung open. Guyuan jumped down and waved Huodan off, lifting the hanging screen himself. "Give me your hand." The wound Chang Geng had given himself with the silver blade looked frightful, but it hadn't hit anything vital. Even if Chen Qingxu hadn't treated him, it would have quickly scabbed over thanks to his Wu'erge reinforced constitution. There wasn't a damn thing wrong with him at this point, but he couldn't resist making the most of his injuries around Guyuan. Chang Geng put on a great show of clinging to Guyuan as he exited the carriage, then used his momentum to bonelessly throw himself into Guyuan's arms. He clung to Guyuan's shoulder and refused to let go, his grip so tight Guyuan couldn't toss him off if he tried. Guyuan had to wonder, what kind of injury granted a person such an increase in strength? Guyuan knew Chang Geng was faking his weakness, but he also felt Chang Geng had truly been wronged. He didn't have the heart to reprimand him. He merely smacked Chang Geng lightly on the back, then bundled him into his cloak and strode off toward the gate. The chilly breeze that followed them into the room roused the bird hanging in the cage at the window. Rudely awakened from its pleasant dreams, the bird shivered at the chill and lashed out in anger. "Bastard! You're freezing Daddy to death! Squawk! 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 Good fortune to you! Beautiful flowers beneath the full moon! May the money come rolling in! May all your wishes come true!" Guyuan was speechless. Man and bird stared at each other until finally, the myna lifted one of its wings to hide its face in shame. It seemed to know its obsequious attitude was an embarrassment and could no longer bear to be seen. Beside him, Chang Geng snickered. General Gu was truly beyond words. "Your face is red from the cold." Guyuan touched Chang Geng's chin. "You're so happy to have stabbed yourself and lost your job, huh? Hurry up and go change." "Giving up all those official duties is a weight off my shoulders," Chang Geng chuckled, then turned to find a clean and dry set of robes. Once changed, he took a seat by the window and snatched up the bird to stroke its feathers. The myna trembled under his attentions, nearly perishing out of fright on the spot. "Hey, Zushi, if I really am Hu Ga'ar's child, who do you suppose was my dad?" "Don't think about such nonsense." Chang Geng laughed lightly. "That person definitely wasn't a barbarian, or they would have left with Hu Ga'ar when she fled. But they must have had a close connection with the barbarian women. They may have even helped plan the consort's escape, and they probably took control of the forces the barbarian women left behind in the capital and the palace, only showing themselves once the capital was besieged." He was speaking, of course, of Great Master Liao Shi, the same candidates as Shen Yi's initial guests, the man Chang Geng had shot to death with his own hands. Guyuan didn't care much. "You mean that Dongying man? Dongying people don't grow as tall as you. But if you really start showing signs of that crow-beaked old monk's ugly mug in the future, I won't want you anymore." Guyuan shook with silent laughter. "I'll get someone to brew some ginger tea. Don't catch a cold." Leaping to his feet, Chang Geng stuffed the bird back into its cage. He tossed the dark cloth over top as a hint of mischief slipped into his tone. "There's no need for tea to drive away my chill. Allow me." All right, everyone. So that concludes the reading of Arc 13, Government Reforms. And you know what? Some things are reforming, all right. I'm actually going to start backwards. So the first thing I want to say is, first off, Wang Guo. You think you slick, but you're really not. Okay. I don't know much about politics and stuff like that, but what I do have most of the time, sometimes, is discernment and just plain common sense. How, when the barbarian mentions Xuniang, are you going to ask, is it really proper to talk about Xuniang and then proceed to talk about her? To get your point across, to drive your point home. Like, sir, I see you. I see what you're doing. And guess what? I'm not the only one who sees you. Everybody else in there see exactly what you're doing. So, okay. Anyway, sorry, I just had to get that off of my chest. Oh, talking about going backwards. I guess I should have said something about Chang Geng resigning from his position. First off, I'm excited about that, but also nervous about that. Like, I feel like that ain't gonna last long. There's no way it can last long because he's too good at what he does. And eventually I feel like His Majesty is going to have to be like, yeah, sir, you going to have to come back because I need you, bro. 我需要你. Anyway, going to the next thing. Two Wu Argus? Oh my gosh. Now that really caught me by surprise that the little prince, the third prince of Jiala Yinghua has the Wu Argus as well. That was pretty scary, and I was wondering what was going to happen with that. It seems like nothing really happened. I mean, truly, something was about to manifest, but it didn't come to fruition. But that's crazy. I feel like they're going to encounter each other again. At least I'm kind of wondering. Am I hoping they will to drive the plot somehow in some weird way? I don't know what I want. But anyway, going back to Wang Guo's plot on exposing the questions of Chang Geng's identity, I'm with Chen Qingshu on this one. After everything that Chang Geng has done, I'm sorry, I don't care about the imperial bloodline not being able to be muddied or anything. After every single freaking frackin' fiddling thing that Chang Geng has done for Great Liang, there is just no way that has no weight, that has no relevance or importance. And at the end of the day, like His Majesty said, considering that the late emperor has already acknowledged him as his son, at that point, it don't even matter. Because, I mean, if he knew that Chang Geng wasn't his son, and yet he still said it, again, it wouldn't matter. If the whole Great Liang knew that, let's just say His Majesty, the late emperor, found some random kid and was like, this is going to be my son. Well, guess what? It's his freaking son. There's nothing that can be done. Oh, I just rhymed. Okay, me. So anyway, yeah. Things... These people, they just be plotting and I can't do stuff like this. I don't have that kind of mind to plot, plan, and strategize against people. That's too much work, especially when you're out to get people for, to push yourself forward, but you're doing nefarious things. Like, that's just too much you got to keep up with. Like, even thinking about the beginning when Fang Qin found himself in a weird situation, and so he turned against the Yu clan and the Liu clan and the Yang or whatever they were. And then now we're in the situation where Wang Guo was like, okay, well, I'm about to turn against you and turn against you. And it's just like, okay, it's too much turning. I'm getting dizzy. I like to live a simple, good, decent human being life. I ain't trying to mess with nobody, okay? Anyway. Let me stop rambling. So I'm just gonna say, I love you guys. Te amo. Ich liebe dich. Well, Eineman, y'all know how it is. I'll see you all next time when we continue with the final arc of this book. We are over halfway done. We are like 2/3 done, actually. We've got about 120 or so pages left, and then we'll be at the final volume. So unless things change, with my schedule, there will be literally 3 more videos after this. Yeah. So I'll talk to you guys later.